To find out more about how cultivated meats can provide a solution to our ecological and climate crisis, as well as other benefits and any potential downside, I spoke with Ben Friedman from Wildtype Foods, a cultivated seafood startup based in San Francisco.
I'm Ben Friedman. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at wildtype. We are a cultivated seafood startup that is launching the world's first cell-cultivated salmon. We create cuts of animal protein without ever having to slaughter an animal. We start with a sample, like a dissection of a fertilized salmon egg in our case, or a juvenile fish, and we do sort of sacrifice the first sort of donor animal. And then we develop a cell line from that cell. So we look for cells that are sort of like stem cells early in their journey. They haven't differentiated yet into a muscle or a fat cell, for example. And we grow those cells in large brewery-like stainless steel tanks. They're called bioreactors. We harvest those cells and we put them through a process where we drain off the liquid that they're grown in. So we just end up with the cells themselves. And then we seed them onto what we call a plant-based scaffold. The cells grow on and within that scaffold to grow into the cuts of salmon that we are used to seeing at the grocery store. In appearance, it's almost identical. In taste and texture, it's really close and has identical levels of omega-3s and omega-6s, like healthy fatty acids. It's a little bit light on protein right now, and it has some carbohydrates as a result of the plant-based scaffold that's still present in the final product. It's super tunable. So we could make it fattier, we could make it higher omega-3, we could make it have other fortifications like putting vitamin D in milk, for example. We could fortify it with other micronutrients that aren't naturally present in salmon or are present but in really small levels. Regarding climate change, there's a 2021 study in the journal Nature that showed that the commercial fishing sector, just the fleets that are doing deep sea trawling that are like dragging nets, produce as much carbon every year as the global aviation sector. They destroy all these seagrass meadows as they like deforest the ocean floor, dragging their nets. So their greenhouse gas emissions is super significant. There's also a recent study showing that biodiversity has a huge impact on decarbonization. The more wild animals that we have and the more we restore and rewild those populations, the better we can decarbonize to sort of pre-industrial levels. Salmon, are among a few of the last wild populations that we eat. Taking wild animals out of the ecosystem is generally bad for the ecosystem and also has a direct link to climate change, we now know. Leaving more fish in the ocean would be better for the world, better for humans. The phrase lab grown is quite pejorative and no one in the industry uses it for that reason. People don't want to eat something that came from a lab, especially in the wake of a pandemic where we've been talking about labs and vaccines. We want to eat things that came from the water and from the land. And so I think that there's a rejection from a lot of consumers, even though most of what they buy in the middle aisles of the grocery store today are quite manufactured and quite processed. There's sort of like a whimsical sort of like wanting to go back to this pastoral past that we envision our food coming from. If you look at beef or pork marketing, right, you look at a package on a sausage or hamburgers, you often see like this pastoral setting, even though that could not be more different from the environment that those animals were raised in and slaughtered in. Food marketing, like all marketing of consumer goods, is very emotional. How you say it, what you say and how you say it matters. Like, don't say lab grown, don't talk about cells, talk about growing animal protein in a new way and use the same sort of vernacular that you would use in food rather than science or pharmaceutical vernacular. Like, that's not going to serve you with consumers in a food setting. There's many attributes of wild type seafood that would lead you to choose it over conventional seafood. For example, much of our conventional seafood has trace amounts of heavy metals like mercury, it has arsenic, has PCBs like from farm runoff, it has antibiotics and pesticides from aquaculture and also from farm runoff. There's all kinds of things in our seafood and in our natural world that are contaminated. We're not living in the world from 10,000 years ago that's like this pristine, wild place where everything we pull from the ground is so pure. We have denigrated our soils and contaminated our water. So much of our farmland still tests positive for arsenic and stuff that were deposited from smelters and the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Any farmland downwind of a smelter probably has some contaminated soil. And similarly, if we're using such chemical intensive agriculture all around the world, all of that farm runoff is running through our river systems into our oceans and getting into our seafood. It's delusional to think that the food that we're used to eating is so pure, We need to feed 10 billion people. How are we going to do that without stripping the world of its resources? We certainly can't do that by harvesting more wild fish. Wild fish stocks around the world are in decline. So what's the answer? By 2030, we're expected to have a 30% global increase in seafood demand. That's about a 25 million ton gap in supply per year. Where is that seafood going to come from? We need to create new sources of food if we're going to feed 10 billion people. If the whole world population ate an American diet, we would need like 178% more arable land than we have. Like we'd be farming huge unavailable amount of land. So we need to come up with vertical high density solutions for feeding people. Salmon are a really important animal. They're a keystone species. So they're as important to the wildlife below them on the food chain as they are above them. In this part of the world, I'm here from San Francisco, and salmon territory range from around this latitude all the way up to Alaska, up the North Pacific coast. That's the reason why our trees are so big here. This life cycle of salmon has shaped the entire topography of this region. Salmon spend some of their life in the ocean, but they're born in rivers and they come back to rivers to spawn. And then once they die, their biomass is a direct conduit of nutrients into our forests. And that's the reason why we have huge trees. It's the reason why we have huge predators like bears. Like we historically had a huge amount of biomass coming from salmon. And so as salmon populations decline, it's directly connected to the decline of other parts of our ecosystems. Apex predators like orca or killer whales and sea lions in the ocean, and same with wolves and eagles and bears and big trees. And salmon are just an incredibly important species because they are a keystone species. And it would be a huge mistake to let them go extinct on our watch. And so even for that reason alone, I think this is a really worthy endeavor. But I think when you fold in feeding 10 billion people and the food security challenges that we're going to face over the next century, I think it becomes an imperative.